Today I'm going to be ranking all of the eyeshadow palettes that I tried in 2023. I have about 35-ish palettes here, and I'm saying ish because a couple of these palettes I'm ranking in collections because like a couple came out at once, you know? I have them all laid out in front of me and I'm so excited to talk about all of these palettes today. I also have posted videos with each of these palettes. If you want to see an eyeshadow tutorial, just search that palette on my channel and it'll pop up for you. Before we get started with the ranking, I wanted to let you know that my palette with Sigma that came out this year, I'm not going to add into the ranking because that's just like, that's unfair, you know? Like, this is my favorite palette of the year. This is the best palette. I created it myself. That is so crazy to say sometimes. Wow. I love my palette because of the mixture of jewel tones. You have your neutrals. I placed my 4 go-to eyeshadows right there in the top quad. This palette is just perfection to me, so of course it is always going to be my #1 at this point. So the worst eyeshadow palette I tried this year, I don't even have anymore because I ended up returning it actually. I think I used it twice and I said, I hate this, I don't even want it anymore. And that palette is the Glossier Monochromes Essential Eyeshadow Trio palette, and I have the shade Jute. I'll pop up a picture right here. Now I bought this palette myself because I wanted to try some more Glossier products. At that point I haven't had tried a lot of Glossier products. I wanted to try some other things and I saw this little trio and I was like, this looks absolutely perfect for an everyday look. This has shades that I like to wear. You have a crease shade, a lid shade, a little highlight shade. I thought it was perfect and I tried it out and the formula was just terrible. I just remember there being like little to no pigment on the shadows. They didn't apply very well. They didn't look good, so I just returned it. That's how bad it was. The second to worst palettes I have tried this year are the Haus Labs Eye Library eyeshadow palettes. Now these just came out a few months ago. I do believe they were limited edition. I did a video on it and I was really excited to try these palettes at first. I think the package is gorgeous with like this little mirror. It feels very nice and luxurious. The color stories are cool. I like this more warm toned one and this one that's more cool tone but with like a fun pop of like a pink and a green. I had pretty high expectations for these palettes and I do remember them saying that these shadows were formulated with like some skincare ingredients in them, which is kind of different. And when I went to apply these shadows, the matte shades were so terrible. They like didn't even show up on my brush. I remember having to dip back in over and over to try to get it to apply. Now the sad part is that these kind of like shimmery, glittery shades are absolutely stunning. I love these shades. So I honestly might try to like depot these two right here, put it in like a little Z palette, and same thing from the more warm tone ones because I know I'm not going to use these ever again. But I do also remember when Haus Labs like first launched at Amazon when it wasn't at Sephora yet, like before the whole rebrand and everything, they did have one palette. It was big, it was silver, I think it was like something Love. It was half warm toned, half blue toned, and I hated that palette as well. So I just feel like Haus Labs needs to kind of get their shit together with their eyeshadow formula, specifically the matte shades. Now the next eyeshadow palette I want to talk about is the Give Beauty eyeshadow quad in Just a Girl. So I actually purchased this palette myself earlier this year because I knew I wanted to do a video with an eyeshadow quad and just kind of show how to use that quad. And honestly, that video is performing great on my channel. I think I did 3 looks with 1 quad, and this eyeshadow formula is fine. It's not amazing, but I do think it is really good for beginners, which is why I used it in that video. I definitely like the matte shades more than the shimmers. I remember having to really build up the shimmers to get it to appear on my eye, but again, I think that can be nice for beginners, but it's just not my favorite eyeshadow formula, and I have some better quads to talk about later on. Next palette I'm kind of upset by because this whole year I thought I was doing really good at not impulse buying stuff, and this was an impulse buy because I saw it online and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna love that. I'm gonna get so much use out of it, and I think I've used it once and I don't even think about it or touch it since. And that is the Viseart Coyish Étendue palette. I'm just so upset about this one because I believe I first saw on Reddit and the post was like, oh my gosh, an all duochrome palette, and I was like, I need that because like I've been trying more duochrome shades and I do wear mostly neutral shadows, but I love a little pop of color. So I was like, oh my gosh, an all duochrome palette sounds perfect for me. And I bought this palette myself. It was also my very first time trying Viseart shadows. I know people love their formulas, but I was so disappointed in this just because the shades really aren't duochromes. I would say that probably 2 or 3 of these shades are actually duochromes, probably those ones right there. The rest are just shimmers. And it was just really disappointing. I really don't see myself using this palette because they are not duochrome shadows. Like that's what I wanted, and it's not it. Now this next palette, I have not done a YouTube eyeshadow tutorial with it, but I did do an Instagram reel / TikTok, I think. And that palette is the Juvia's Place Afrogalactic palette. And here is the color story. So when I look at this palette, I hate the color story. Like, it is hard for me to put shades together, but the reason why this isn't in the bottom is because the formula is great. I really do like the formula of their shadows. The mattes are super pigmented, and some of these like duochrome multi-chromes in here are stunning, and that's the shades that I used in that look I did for Instagram. So pretty much this palette isn't in the bottom just because of the formula, and some of these shades just really are stunning, but the color story just does not make sense to me. All right, so the next palette is the Huda Beauty Cool Toned Matte Obsessions 9-pan palette that came out earlier this year. Well, they all came out this year, obviously. So she came out with a warm tone version and a cool tone version, and they're all matte shadows. And I bought this one just because I thought it'd be kind of cool to have an all cool tone palette, but it does lean pretty kind of pinky and rosy, and especially the video that I posted with it, like that look is like pretty mauvey, I would say. I guess I was hoping for more like cool tone browns, and I just don't see myself using this palette a lot, so that's why it is towards the bottom. Next palette is the Anastasia Fall Romance palette. Oh my gosh, when this one launched, I tried so hard to make this palette work for me, but I don't think it's very good at all, honestly. I think I have a couple videos with and about this palette because I was just so upset by it. I think it is my least favorite Anastasia palette ever, and if you watch my videos, you would know that I love her formula. I typically love her palettes, so this was a huge letdown for me. But just like with the other palettes, there are some shades that do stand out with this one. I do use this cool toned leather shade a lot just for like a quick little look in my crease. I also like Smoke and Moonlight and Fireside, but a lot of these shades on the end here just kind of turn up muddy, especially when you try to use these shades together. I feel like the promo pictures didn't look like what we saw in the palette. This Divine shade was like one of the most disappointing shadows of the year, honestly. I keep looking at the palettes I just ranked and I was like, should I have ranked this lower? I don't know, but yeah, it's pretty low on the list for me. So now pretty much every palette after the Anastasia one I do genuinely like. Do I love it? Not yet, but I like them and I think they're good palettes, so let's dive into those. The next palette I want to talk about is the Melt Cosmetics Dark Matter palette. Now, I was so excited when I saw that this palette was being released because I loved the Dark Matter stack that they had. I hit pan on a few of those shades in there. Like, I used to use that all the time back in what, like 2015? And I do really like the formula and the color story of this palette, whereas it's kind of like a little deeper, smokier, neutral palette, but you still have some kind of like reddish wine tones up here. But the one thing I just really hate about this palette is the layout. It is so big for like no reason. These shadows are so small and they could have like probably cut this thing in half, you know what I mean? So it's like they made this palette so big for no reason. I also kind of wish they would have just done it in their typical palette format. Like for example, like the Gemini 2 palette. I like this layout of their palettes. Like, you know what I mean? This just looks so much better to me. So next I want to talk about some alter ego palettes. They did have 3 dupe palettes this year. So first we have the Coastal palette, which is a dupe of the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz. And then we have the Sakura palette, which is a dupe of Natasha Denona Retro Glam. And then we have the Mirage palette, which is a dupe of Huda Beauty Empowered. So I put these palettes kind of in the middle to low end of my ranking just because I feel like I can't really speak on the color stories because these are dupes of high-end palettes. But for that same reason, that's also kind of why they are in the middle, because I do think these palettes are a great option for someone who just can't afford the high-end palettes, because palettes are running what, like 70 bucks nowadays for a Huda Beauty palette? Like, that is just crazy. So I do like that they create more affordable options for those super expensive palettes, and I think their formula is really, really good. The next palette is a controversial one from this year, and that is the Natasha Denona Xenon palette. I thought about ranking this palette a little bit higher, but then I was like, how often am I really going to use this entire palette to create a look? And I say that because a lot of these matte shades, like this one, boom, boom, barely show up on my skin tone. Like, they were not necessary in this palette. I have a couple videos about this palette and comparing it to Pretty Grunge and I Need a Nude. So I'm not really a fan of these lighter matte shades, but I do really like the shimmers in this palette. And I know that if I ever wanted kind of a silvery look, I'd probably go for this shade all over my lid. So while I don't think I'll get a lot of use out of this entire palette, there are shades that I really do like, but I do also feel like this palette kind of fills a hole in my collection. You'll see that I don't have anything else like this. Next, I wanted to quickly talk about the Sigma 9 frying pan palettes that launched this year. So they launched 4 this year, and I ranked these palettes in the middle because of course I love Sigma's formula, but some of these palettes were just kind of a miss for me. The color stories aren't amazing, but there are a few that I do like. Let me show you the 4 that launched in my worst to best. So out of these 4, electric pink is my least favorite. I just don't really wear pink eyeshadow. Next, I would probably put the beachy palette. I like the idea of it, but I really didn't like this one Riptide shade. It looks really cool in the pan, but it kind of shows that matte black, almost exactly like that shade. And the blue shades are gorgeous and add a really pretty pop, but the neutral shades are pretty basic in my opinion. Next, I would rank the Jewels palette. I really liked the idea of it, but I wish they did even more jewel tones with the matte shades. We have these 3 gorgeous jewel tone shimmers, but all the mattes are pretty warm neutral, and I wish there's just a little more jewel tone in it because I love jewel tone shadows. But my favorite one out of the 4 is definitely the Earthy palette. I love the matte neutral shades in this palette and how they lean a little bit on that mustard side with the pop of the greens in here is so gorgeous. So those are the 4 Sigma on the Go palettes. Next in my ranking are all of the Odens Eye palettes I have tried this year, which I didn't realize there were this many. Do you see what I mean though? How I said I'm ranking these kind of by collection. I put all these Odens Eye ones together in the same kind of ranking just because like they're really gorgeous palettes, but I just don't grab for color like I used to. All right, I have 6 Odens Eye palettes in front of me, so here's how I would rank these 6. At the bottom, I would put the Hey Reindeer palette that launched this last holiday. Like I said, this is all going to be about the color story because the formula is great. This palette just screams spring to me. I don't really get a wintry vibe from this, and I remember when I filmed with this palette, I had a really hard time putting together some color combos, so that's why this one is 6. The 5th palette would be the Angelica Little Ghost palette. Now, it is so cool that Angelica got to partner with Odens Eye again on another collection. And this Little Ghost one is fun. Like, I could see myself using these blue shadows if I know I wanted to do a blue look or kind of a red, really warm look here. But again, I'm just not really going to reach for this color story a lot. The 4th palette would be the Trick or Treat palette from that same collection with Angelica. Now, I put this palette above Little Ghost because I love this color story, and this does scream Halloween to me with like the greens and the orange and the black. I love it. The 3rd palette is going to be the Jewels and Gems palette. Now, this color story is really pretty. I like how it's kind of more cool toned, a little bit of a mauve-y vibe, kind of dusty as well, so I really like this color story. My 2nd favorite Odens Eye palette from this year is the Snow Dream palette. I just think this color story is so cute, and I feel like Snow Dream is so fitting for this. I don't know how to explain it, but I just feel like excited and happy when I see these colors. Like, all of these shimmers in here are so pretty. I do think that Odens Eye has one of the best shimmer formulas. And then my favorite out of these 6 palettes from this year is the Stone and Rock one. I am a sucker for green eyeshadow, especially that kind of mustardy, pukey color. I just think it is so pretty. I think I've only done one look with this palette on camera, but I can see myself creating so many different looks with this. It is so gorgeous. So those are all the Odens Eye palettes. Speaking of green eyeshadow palettes that I love, the next palette is the Natasha Denona Yucca palette. I just love this color story. I feel the same way as I did when I look at that Odens Eye Stone and Rock palette. Like, all of these shimmers in here, all of those, I want on my eyelid right now. I definitely did not get to use this palette enough when it came out this year, so I think I'm going to do another video with it pretty soon because I want to use and love it more. The next palette in my ranking is the Sigma and An Knook palette. I was so excited to find out that An was doing a palette with Sigma. Her and I have a very similar type of video style here on YouTube where we like to do close-up eyeshadow tutorials, and I have watched so many of her videos. Like, she is so precise at her eyeshadow. It is so beautiful. So of course, a palette just makes so much sense for her. I also really like the layout of this palette, and if you look at the palette kind of in rows, and I like how the palette is kind of split up between your warm kind of neutral shades with your more colorful cool tone shades. I can also appreciate the row of grays right here, whereas I don't really wear gray eyeshadow a lot, but I knew if I ever wanted to, I would go to these grays because it's like a perfect gradient right there. I just realized we're getting pretty close to the end here, so we're getting to the really good stuff. Next on my ranking are the Sigma eyeshadow quads that came out this year. I think Sigma absolutely crushed these quads. Like I was talking about earlier with the Give Beauty quad, the formula wasn't great. I didn't really love the shimmers, but these ones are perfect in my opinion if you're looking for a quad. I believe they came out with 6 color stories, but my top 4 are Tiramisu, so we have a really nice kind of cool tone color story. Then we have a caramel apple, which is a green with a little pop of neutral. This next one is creme brulee, and I love it because of the neutral browns, but this gold right here is gorgeous. And then my favorite quad that they did is definitely the peach pie one. This is like my perfect everyday eyeshadow quad. I've done a video titled that video. This is the perfect quad in my opinion. And I keep saying they're perfect because in each quad you have a crease shade, a deepening shade, a lid shade, and a highlight shade. Like, it is as simple as that. It is great for beginners. Guys, we are at my top 5 right now. That is crazy. So a palette number 5 is the Sigma Beauty and the Beast palette. Now Sigma has come out with a few of these Disney collections now, and I think they do a great job every time. This palette is so pretty. These 6 neutral shades right here are like all of the neutral shades of my dreams to create so many different kinds of looks. And then I also really like the color in this palette. Like, yes, it's color, but it's not an intimidating kind of color, which I think Sigma does a really good job at that. I think I've done 2 videos with this palette, and I still want to do one more look with this Enchantress shade right here. This is just stunning. The 4th palette in my ranking is the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude. You cannot be shocked that this palette is number 4 for me. I have done, I think, probably 5 videos with this palette now. I just keep wanting to do more looks with it because I just love this color story. I love this newer formula that Natasha is doing. I believe it's like the Sparkling Wet Effect, this like Delilah shade, this Mia shade. They're so pretty all over the lid. I think my biggest complaint with this palette is just that these 2 shades are so similar, especially on the eyes, but other than that, like, no complaints from me. It's great. Now my 3rd palette for my ranking is the What's Up Beauty Dragon Eye palette. Now this palette did come out pretty recently. I believe I did 2 tutorials with it because after I did one look with it, I was like, I want to use this again so bad. And the reason why this palette is ranked so highly is because of these duochrome, multi-chrome shades. Every single one of these is gorgeous. I know I haven't done any swatches in this whole video, but like, I just have to. Like, I love this. Like, remember earlier in the video when I was talking about that Vizier palette that was supposed to be all duochromes? Like, this is what I wanted that to be, and that's why this makes me so happy. I can just see myself reaching for these shimmery shades all the time. I just think What's Up Beauty crushed this palette. Now, my 2nd favorite palette of the year is a palette that I actually have not used on camera yet. I did use it once for a Bright Besties video, but that's because I've only had this palette for about a month, and I was doing my 12 days of tutorials in December where I was using more older palettes, so I wasn't really using anything new, but the palette is the Patrick Ta Major Dimensions 3 palette. I am so freaking happy that I bought this palette. I went back and forth on it for a while because I was like, do I really need it? But I just could not stop thinking about it, so I ended up buying it with a 20% off coupon at Sephora. And this is literally just what neutral dreams are made of. Every single shade in here is matte, but you do have these 2 cream shades down here. And if you watch my videos, you know I normally don't love cream shades in a palette, but I can get these to work for me, which is crazy. This palette just has everything I need for every day. I love the matte white, the matte black, all the browns, how it's kind of separated from warm tone to cool toned. Like, I am gonna get so much use out of it. I'm so happy to have this in my collection. Okay, are you ready for my top palette of the year? Huda Beauty Pretty Grunge palette. Yay! If I could do like sound effects, I would put that right there, but I don't know how to do that. I just feel so happy talking about this palette. I love this so much more than I expected to. I think I've posted 5 videos with this palette, and you know if I keep pushing out videos with the palette, that means that I love it. I love how this palette is laid out. You have your neutral shades here, you're kind of more cool toned, a little bit grungy, kind of mauve-y shades over here. You have a matte black, there are gorgeous shimmers in here, and there's just such a big range of looks that you can get from this palette, which is why I keep doing videos with it, because I'm like, whoa, there's so much to do with this. Huda Beauty does have one of my favorite formulas to work with. Her shadows are so easy to use, but they're so pigmented at the same time. I feel like it's such a big deal when I'm like, this is my favorite palette of the year, but like, that is a big deal. Like, this was the top for me. And this palette has definitely earned its place on top of my desk. I do reach for it when I do my makeup, whether I want just kind of like a soft transition shade. I grab this matte black all the time. Love, love, love. I had so much fun ranking all the palettes that I tried this year. I would love to know, what are your top 3 palettes that you have tried? Do we have any similar palette rankings? Please let me know. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.